Eldon. Well, we next move to a panel discussion regarding people groups data and its gaps. Our panelists are going to be Dan Scribner, David Markham, George Guma, and Jim Courson. I will let the panel introduce themselves and their ministries, and then they'll share what they're perceiving as gaps, challenges, and progress in this area. Go ahead, panelists. I see we've got Dan Scribner highlighted, spotlighted already. If you could unmute, Dan.
Sure. Thank you very much, Dan. It's a great privilege to be here. I serve with Joshua Project, and I'll share my screen real quickly just to review some of these potential gaps and challenges. Hopefully you can see that. I think some of the main challenges with people group data are differing definitions and criteria used by various people group lists. I won't comment on all these in 3 minutes. And confusion over different counts and terms where you have UPGs, UUPGs, FPGs, MUPGs, etc. An alphabet soup that can get pretty confusing. Another big challenge is moving away from individuals identifying themselves solely by one ethnic people group. Maybe they identify now more with different groupings. It's been said that youth in Saudi Arabia may identify more with their peers in Chicago than they do with their own parents. And that creates a real problem of maintaining the 100% rule. Maybe the biggest thing of all, and we've already touched on it a little bit today, is that globalization, urbanization, migration, and language consolidation are rapidly blurring traditional people group boundaries. But that leads to some challenges, some gaps that maybe we could think about tomorrow, especially that right now we have snapshots of people group data and their progress, but not really trends. We don't know if the health of the church is up or down or plateaued. Another gap is maybe true crowdsourcing, updating of data. Eldon touched on this third one just a moment ago. They're a real platform for conversation and cataloging of non-database people group information. Great opportunities, I think, with Ethnopedia as well as the upcoming IMB GAP system, but just a way for people to network around a people group rather than strictly through a database. I think another gap is a system for tracking people group adoption and real-time prayer items. Another would be the availability of movement data at the people group level. Justin Long and others doing tremendous work on tracking that, and if there was a way we could tag that at the people group level, I think would be very helpful. And then maybe another gap is a set of guidelines and best practices for trusted brokers. So a few challenges and gaps from my perspective. So back to you, Dan. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Yes, David Markham.
Hello. I work with the Ethnopedia community, which is a group of people. Right now, it's a small group of people. And we're translating people profiles into other languages, mainly Spanish. There are some other language translations going on. And I also serve in the Latin missionary movement. It's called CMIWC, and I'm the adopted people person for CMIWC. I've been doing that for about 10 years. I have a presentation. It's not PowerPoint. This is kind of the way after working with the data for 20 plus years, I see that we have, well, at least what's available to the public. We've got two different onions with different layers. And the outer layer are the people groups, which you could call ROP or ROP3. But this inner layer, which is also extremely important, is ROL. Now, our definitions of people groups are different. However, across the databases, the main databases, they pretty much line up on about 8,500. So even though some of our definitions may be different, basically, when we talk about a people group, it's either been given an ROP code or it hasn't. That's a problem, of course. But this ROL level, which is extremely important to missionary sending, because those who are going to a people group who speaks a different language needs to know whether that language has a Bible translation. Well, there's another level here, which is status. Are there Christians? Are there no Christians? So between the two different data sets that we have available to us at the public level, people like myself and others who work in other missionary movements who have to take those two data sets have to reconcile this, because there are people groups that exist here that don't exist here. I drew the arrow the wrong direction. You can disregard that arrow there.
We need you to be aware of a little bit of time too, David. Thanks, brother.
Sure. So
I'm
this
thinking
middle,
that since these four people also get the next 12 minutes as Q&A, I might let each of you run longer here so that you can complete your
Okay.
presentation.
well,
Thank you, Dan.
here's
My
the
apologies.
gap. Here's the gap. It's not necessarily that the people groups don't line up. Pretty much those who speak the same language, those people groups, they don't line up at the language level. And more importantly, they don't line up at the status level, which is, are they reached or not? And of course, you could go deeper. You know, population is probably at the bottom of this priority list here. But those are the kind of gaps that present problems to people who are working in data, trying to provide data to ministries, organizations, unreached people group, movements, etc.
Good. Thank you, David. George, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you very much. So this is George Guma, mission research worker in Ghana, serving with Ghana Evangelical Missions Association, and also helping with Ghana Evangelism Committee. So let me put this first, that we celebrate all these existing data and agencies that help with people group information and other missions information. And as we help the church and make strategic decisions, these comments and feedback comes up to us. People group information seems to be easily accessible and shareable, and comprehensive as well. We acknowledge that, and I expect that we should have the church running into these sites and these existing information and cleaning on them and making decisions out of them. But some of my experience shows that unfortunately we don't see so many people using these for strategic decisions. And some of the information presented are also quite old, that needs updating. So we have to look at reviewing and updating some of the information. There are different figures and information that Dan has already alluded to about the same people from different sources. And sometimes you pick an information from this source and is different from another source, and you're like, how do I make amends? Yeah, there are different. Yeah, there are different. Many people do not understand how these statistical analysis come about. We may say, oh, it's limited to researchers and we have to only know, but sometimes it's make it difficult for people to make use of it. How do you come, for instance, about evangelicals in Ghana? It's easy to compute Christian because you can have it from the census data. So people groups across borders are a big reality that is of great interest. How do you understand Kotokoli in Ghana, in Togo, in Benin? How do you understand Fulani in Niger, in Mali, in Guinea, in Burkina Faso? And what are the dynamics? And so we need to understand some of those things. And I think they are reality that we've been able to capture, and we need to continue to do that. In terms of ethnographic data, some sources of data are limited and generalized. We can't pick part of from one Kotokoli town and information and then generalize that information about Kotokoli people. Extrapolations and realities in people group statistical analysis are another gap. People group homelands are not well represented. I wish I had enough time to show that, but to represent in Ghana, every indigenous people group, every ethnic group has a homeland, and that is better mapped with a polygon than a point. Globally, we may look at it as a point, but nationally, polygon represents it better. There's little or no tracking of people group migration vis-a-vis urbanization growth, which, as we know, mentioned already. But one key thing I want to end with is transition of people groups from one stage. This is unengaged to another level. This is least reached. This is the kind of way Joshua Project looks at it, minimally reached and all that. We need to really look into that, into details. And there's also little information about some people groups that we need to update and probably look at it in details. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And Jim.
Hi, I'm Jim Corson, and it's good to be with you. I'm going to drop into the chat some information about some of the websites that have data that we provide, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work that I do. I work with global research for the International Mission Board. My particular focus or interest is on spatial data. When I first started working with people groups, we had a pretty comprehensive list, but we did not have good location data. And so that's been the focus. I sometimes describe that to people as simply putting people groups on a map. It's important to know where they are as a first step in sending resources to engage them. So we talk about the where of lostness. I began my work with IMB in Taiwan in 1990 as a church developer. After language study was involved in starting a couple of churches. And then in 2001, I shifted to a research role that was focused on all of East Asia. The main challenge there being looking at people groups in China, particularly in Southwest China, some of the smaller minority groups. And ultimately, that led in 2007 to my coming back to the US, Richmond, Virginia, where I work in the home office of the IMB. And the primary task there was to build a data set of spatial data for all the people groups. Some of the challenges have already been mentioned by others on the panel here. We started with point data, but then we also moved beyond that to develop polygons. It's one thing to have a point that shows on a global map, hey, this is where people groups are. But to identify the homeland for each group is essential for us in being able to help others understand where they need to go. So trying to capture that distribution of a group is essential to us. And in the data that I dropped into the chat, there's an open data reference site. All of the data that we develop is delivered to peoplegroups.org, which is our primary website for visualizing information, showing their status, lostness. But our open data site makes that data available to you for download, the points, the polygons, all of the data, including data related to the Registry of Peoples. And that's the third area that I want to talk about. In 2010, I picked up the role of editing the Registry of Peoples. And a lot of excellent work had been done on that registry in the years leading up to 2010. But for the last 12 years now, I've been working with that. And some people don't fully understand the differences in the different registries. When we talk about the Registry of Languages, it is a definitive list of the languages in the world. But the Registry of Peoples is a bit different. The Registry of Peoples is not a definitive list of the peoples in the world, but it is a code set that cross-references data from Joshua Project, IMB, and the World Christian Database. We accept data from other sources. We have some other non-global sources that contribute data from time to time. But essentially what the Registry of Peoples does is to provide a code for anything in any user set that is a people group. So in that sense, the Registry of Peoples attempts to be comprehensive, and those codes can allow you, if you find a people group on Joshua Project, it would allow you then to find what does IMB have to say about that same group, or what does the World Christian Database have to say about that same people group. I like the challenge of trying to find information on people groups. It is indeed challenging, and I think it's one of those cases where what we desperately need are more local sources in different countries who can contribute what they know about people groups to our understanding to fill in some of the gaps. And I think I'll just stop there and we can move to questions.
Thank you, Jim. Okay, so considering, am I unmuted? I hope I am. Considering what we've just heard, I'd like to now just pose each of you a question and give you a few moments to reply. You've got a minute and a half or 2 minutes. Dan, after 25 years of ministry, how have you seen the unreached people group data change?
Oh, massively, Dan. I think obviously the first one is just an ability to communicate and share information. I remember in the 1990s, people group data was often gathered through postal mail and handwritten letters, where email was a novelty. So that's been a massive change, just the ability to communicate and share information. Definitely in the last 25 years, increased accuracy as well as granularity. The data is becoming more and more defined. Still a long way to go, but the picture is getting clearer and clearer. I remember a phone call from a gentleman in the late 90s who said, "I love your work, but this entry on your list is a river, not a people group." So we're getting away from that, I hope. But another big change is just genuine collaboration and a willingness to share data. Andrew Feng shared a chart yesterday called Collaborative Advantage Scale. We really moved from networking to real genuine collaboration where people are really wanting to benefit one another. And I think maybe the best thing, and I think it was just touched on, but it's just far more field and national input. I would love to see more and more of that. But it's just a great encouragement, a blessing to see national initiatives taking up the challenge of researching and reaching the people, unreached groups in their own country, and then consolidating that into a global picture. So some of those kind of changes.
Thank you. David, how could true crowdsourced people group information affect the way we collect and utilize people group data?
Unmute, Dave. There you go.
Well, first of all, we would need to have some sort of crowdsourcing tool. And of course, that would affect everything. And if that tool, I haven't seen much success with this, and I've gotten into every one of these collaborative efforts that's come along. The gentleman who presented on the first day has this new thing going, and God bless him. And so many things have come along that we've tried to do, and we need that. Somewhere, someone has to think about that. Once we have that, now we need to get this rough draft of Ghana. Let's just say between the main sources, we don't know what Ghana is really like. Neither the Joshua Project nor the IMB, even though we have the people groups and we have the languages, put together in this form that we do. We need to give that list over to Ghana and say, here's the rough draft of what we have, because that's what we have. Just like Dan just said, we got a long way to go. And it's true. The precision of the data that we have at the global level, maybe at 70%. Our language list is not complete yet. We're still discovering new languages. And of course, that goes up to people groups. So there's a lot of people groups yet to be discovered. And we need to hand that rough draft over to Ghana and say, Ghana, you do what you need to do with this rough draft in your own language. That's another barrier. Ghana, they speak a certain language at their country level. They need to use their own language and do their own research for them, just like Dan from the gentleman who spoke the first day. They need to tell us, and we're doing the best we can. And I applaud to all of these efforts. Dan and Jim, Dwayne and Bill Morris and the others, they've done an enormous, huge task of trying to piece everything together. Now we have the rough draft. We need to get that down to the people.
Great. Thank you, David. George, you've used the term ground truthing in some situations. Could you explain that term for us?
Yeah, thank you, Dan. As a cartographer, it's very, all these discussions are summed up in ground truthing. And in remote sensing, ground truthing is the use of data collected, that is information that is known to be real or true, in close observation. So the key word is close observation, to better interpret and verify data that has been inferred or collected remotely. So when you see the satellite data picks an information of the real world, let's say it picks ethnographic data, demographic data, ministry data, Joshua Project and other ministries, you pick this information from broad perspective. It's a huge work. And so we need ground truthing to verify, to better help with these understanding this information out there. It's also used in meteorology conditions for flyovers. So a plane moving says, I predict the weather will be this at this point. But when you close to that point, there will be a ground information that proves that it corroborates or not. So effective ground truthing helps to solve issues of disparities, contrarieties, discrepancies, and so forth. And where should we do that? I believe it should be at a national level and other sub-national levels, state, region, province, county, and district levels. And I have a structure we developed for that, and that could be shared for further discussions. Who experts working temporarily in different countries can help, but indigenous researchers, not any indigenous person. Indigenous researchers with who can bridge the gap between the ground reality and then research out there.
Great.
Right.
Thank you, George. We are running out of time.
Great.
Thank
great,
you.
Thank you.
Jim, do you want to make a brief comment about, can you share how globalization, urbanization, migration, and language consolidation, boy, those are big words, are blurring traditional people group boundaries?
Yeah, I
Briefly,
think I
please.
can solve that one in 1 minute. No.
Great.
You know, I think we tend to think of our people groups as bounded sets. We've got hard boundaries and people exist only in one group. You know, one of the things that Ralph Winter talked about was we want to count each person only once. But in that, he said people identify in multiple ways. So the challenge is to find the way that they most closely identify. So I was thinking about this last week as we had some Asian Americans making a presentation in our chapel, and they were describing their parents' generation compared to their generation. Their parents speak Korean and Chinese. These two guys were pastors of multi-ethnic English congregations, and as they were speaking, I thought they aren't on our people group list. We have Chinese and we have Koreans, but we don't have this Asian American that would represent who they are. So I think we need to hold loosely to our lists, but we need to very intentionally review our list and try to identify the different people groups and how they identify themselves and work to get those on our list. And globalization and urbanization are two really hot button issues that we're dealing with. And so I'm going to drop into the chat also a link to a journal that we have an article coming out in about a month that addresses these in more detail.
Excellent, excellent. So I just heard you say that new people groups are emerging all the time from generation to generation.
They are. And in fact, as I was querying the registry of peoples this morning, just to look and see over the last 6 years, 1,502 new codes have been added. So I think we sometimes think of these as these are fixed data sets. They're frozen in time from the 90s. That's not really true. They're changing. People groups are taken off. People groups are added. So I think we're getting closer to the picture, but we don't have all the pieces of the puzzle yet.
Very good. Thank you, gentlemen. I wish we could let you continue on, but we need to go to our next panel as well.